everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Nicole, a continuing education coordinator for the collaborative. Please feel free to submit questions into the Q&A or the chat at any time. We will address all your questions at the end of today's presentation. I would now like to introduce today's speaker, Andrew White. Andrew is a professor of medicine in the Division of General Internal Medicine at the University of Washington. He works as a hospitalist at the University of Washington Medical Center Montlake campus. He is also board certified in clinical informatics and serves UW Medicine as Assistant Chief Clinical Information Office for Clinical Decision Support. Andrew is the Director of Education Programs at the UW Center for Scholarship in Patient Care Quality and Safety, where he directs multiple local and regional training programs in methods to improve healthcare quality, safety, value, and equity. His research interests include improving patient-physician communication after medical error and applying informatics interventions to improve health and patient safety outcomes. Since 2020, he has been leading the development and testing of video-based communication assessment simulation tool for teaching error disclosure communication skills to physicians. Thank you so much for being here today, Andrew. And with that, I will pass it off to you for today's presentation.
Okay, well, thanks so much for having me. That's right. I'm going to talk about the video communication assessment, or I'll abbreviate VCA, for use in error disclosure training. And I want to first acknowledge that this is, I think, nicely placed in the CAI webinar series, and that we had a really robust conversation, a great presentation a couple months ago from leaders around the country about how do we prepare trainees to discuss adverse events with transparency and accountability. And so this is sort of a really deep dive into one technique for doing that. I want to mention right up front that the VCA is software that was developed by the National Board of Medical Examiners, or NBME. And my one disclosure here is that I've received past and current grant support from the NBME to help do the research on this software tool that we think is a promising way to help develop error disclosure skills. But obviously they've had a role in funding that. So the learning objectives here are, first, that I'd like you all to be able to evaluate the available techniques for teaching adverse event communication skills in GME, or graduate medical education. So that's residency and fellowship. After I explain what the VCA is, I hope you'll be able to then describe the functions and the potential benefits of the VCA for communication scenario practice and feedback. And when you have seen some of the data about how it works within test curricula, to analyze options for deploying the VCA in GME error disclosure curricula. And we'll also think together in this talk about non-GME settings, because I think this will have applications in undergraduate medical education, or UME, and potentially even in healthcare institutional settings as part of CME. So how is it that residents learn about adverse event communication? And I'm sorry, one thing I mentioned to Nicole earlier, I have some back pain, and I may stand periodically through the talk and turn off the video briefly, if it's just so you don't have to look at my midsection here. But I may do that in a moment. This should come as no surprise to everybody here, so I'll cover this briefly. But after patients are harmed by care, the communication from healthcare institutions and from physicians rarely meets their needs for content, for information, for emotion handling, for support, accountability. There are a lot of dimensions in which we fall short. And some of that has to do with the ways that healthcare institutions support clinicians. But we know from a solid body of literature that physicians don't feel prepared for these conversations through their education. And that's a major factor for why they struggle sometimes. And to address this, the ACGME, or the Accreditation Council on Graduate Medical Education, mandated in 2017 as part of their common program requirements that all residents and fellows receive training and participation in disclosure, whether real or simulated. Now, that was a first step that went into enforcement in 2019. And they made some exciting steps recently in late 2023 and built upon that mandate for training and expanded, I think, in a direction that we can all agree is much more robust, is they modified that requirement, said now we must demonstrate that residents and fellows have competence using tools and techniques for disclosure of patient safety events, again, including the language of real or simulated. So moving up sort of the educational achievement hierarchy from just having received exposure to requiring a demonstration of competence. Part of the reason they did this is because they conducted a really massive survey of over 11,000 residents all around the country as part of the CLEAR review process in 2021. And they asked them, what was the training you received on air disclosure? And I think obviously it's disappointing that several years into this mandate, more than a quarter said I didn't get any training on this at all. And the other methods here, I'm going to talk about why the bulk of them are suspect. So in the context of this survey, informal meant basically in the conduct of clinical care. So through observation, sort of hidden curriculum, either doing it themselves or observing a physician supervisor do it. And then the majority or a large minority received either online modules or lectures. Only 7% engaged in simulation, and that's their opportunity to practice in a safe setting. So that was really a very uncommon method for teaching these skills. And I think these methods really should raise an alarm because establishing competency really does mean you have to demonstrate a skill rather than strictly having knowledge. And the practices that were in use in 2021, and I suspect persist in a lot of training programs, lean a little too heavily on lectures. So lectures are really essential. You have to learn some background to be able to do this skill well, but a lecture alone is insufficient. It's not going to impart the skill. You need practice. And real life practice is fraught with all kinds of problems. So one issue is that in many specialties, it's infrequent. It's also occurring sometimes in an incredibly high stakes environment where it's very stressful to learn, and not performing effectively has implications for all the people in the institution involved. But we also know from a small body of literature that the feedback is minimal, that residents are sometimes sidelined, and when they're included, those conversations often conclude without feedback from either the patient or a supervising physician. So they're left to form their own conclusions and may not learn in ways that are productive or successful. So practice in a safe environment seems really important to augment those. Real life practice is going to happen. It's just, again, not sufficient. And traditionally, the options available to educators are either standardized patients or role play, but these also have some pretty substantial downsides, especially when you look at the challenge of meeting this national mandate. Standardized patients are costly and difficult to deploy in a widespread and sometimes and they can't be done asymmetrically, meaning like you can't have the resident go home and do it in their free time. And we have 100,000 trainees in US medicine, not to mention the medical students. So it's a lot of standardized patients to lean on. But also there's a solid body of literature that this kind of skill is not something that standardized patients excel at assessing. They're great at using checklists, but a single individual has pretty high unreliability, or they're unreliable assessors as they move from practice session to practice session, or when you rotate out standardized patients. So training programs have a hard time knowing where the skill level of their residents would be. And for those of you who have done role play, this is cheap, it's often easy, but it also has low fidelity, and it's hard to get feedback from a supervisor or a peer. And sometimes it just doesn't work, right? So the peer role play sometimes sort of descends into breaking character and giggling, and so that's a real sort of pitfall there. I think the best review of work in this area was by a group out of Toronto. It's now over 10 years old. And at that time, there were just over 20 studies of error disclosure curricula in GME and UME. And most of this curricula could demonstrate improvements in knowledge, but really there just wasn't enough work on whether skills were acquired. And often the ones that were testing for skills didn't measure control group. So it was hard to know if it was really working or not. I'd like to take a step back, a big step back, and just think about what does it take to learn something well? And I want to cite concepts coming out of expert performance theory. You may have heard of this in the setting of claims that you have to practice the violin for 10,000 hours to be a master, right? And that's, I think, a really major oversimplification of what's a pretty robust science. But when you dig a little bit deeper, they have found key ingredients that get a learner to where they need to be. And I'm not actually proposing that residents need to be masters at error disclosure. We're just shooting for competence, but this framework gives us a way to do that. So you have to have somebody who's motivated. They have to have the desire to learn. They do have to have theoretical instruction, just as an elite swimmer needs to know a little bit of nutrition, a little bit of physiology and some hydrodynamics. An elite violinist needs to understand some properties found. We need our residents to understand the basics. That's where the lecture comes in. But then you have to add to that deliberate practice. Tough skills don't develop without practice, and it can't be naive practice, right? Kids learn a lot by kicking and throwing things, but it doesn't make them expert soccer players. Deliberate practice means setting the ball on the hash mark and say, I'm going to kick this 80 times until I can get it into the upper right of the net, and then I can do that in a game. That's that deliberate practice of identifying a skill and doing it over and over and over, and doing it with assessment and feedback. Add on to that internal representations of excellence. This is like playing a CD of a master violinist and then saying, okay, now I hear how they do that sequence of notes. I'm going to try to replicate that. You can cultivate that through coaching or by observing experts. You have to have all these components to build talent at that level. And I think this framework applies to error disclosure, even though we're not seeking mastery. And it informs the design of the next generation of teaching techniques. So what we realized we needed to get past this sort of online module and standardized patient sort of roadblock is a practical, cost-effective, proven system that allows learners to simulate in a safe space error disclosure practice and then to get statistically reliable feedback so they can make improvements. And what I'm going to argue to you in the next session or part of this talk is that the VCA is one of I think, the emerging and very promising ways to do that. The VCA is software that allows simulated practice of error disclosure with crowdsourced feedback from lay people through the MTurk or Mechanical Turk engine, and I'll explain much more about that in a moment. So what is the VCA? At a high level, it is software that presents the user with a scenario, either on a phone or a web browser. They watch a video clip of an actor portraying a situation. And I want to mention quickly, the VCA is being used by researchers all over for a lot of different other communication scenarios. I just happen to be deeply involved in trying to test this for error disclosure training. So these cases are for patient harm, but you could use it for other situations. But then after watching that trigger video, the user is asked to record what they would say to that patient if they were the doctor in the room. It doesn't record video, and that audio clip is then sent out to batches of raters through Amazon's Mechanical Turk. This is a web platform for crowdsourcing human intelligence tasks where you wouldn't employ somebody to do it, but you can use their several 100,000 panel of people who are English-speaking, US-based adults who are available who are offered tasks uh, and are paid a small sum to go ahead and do them. So they are offered a set of these audio clips to rate on an instrument that I'll show in a moment, and we try to get 8 to 10 of them to rate each audio response. And the variables that we use, I'll show those in a moment, but this is really the heart of crowdsourcing. It's the concept that you're not relying on either a single individual expert who may be expensive to hire, or a single person off the street, but this pretty widely accepted phenomenon that if you get 8 or 10 people off the street, their average guess is really just as good as an expert. And I'm going to substantiate that claim in a little bit here. After that, and after some analysis of the data to make sure that there aren't people who were just indiscriminately picking this, we have measures of attention to make sure that they're actually paying attention, and they also complete a text suggestion response that's about the entire set, not about an individual user. And that creates scores and suggestions for improvement. So why was this a really good fit for error disclosure? Well, first of all, it allows for simulating a rare situation and practice in a low stakes environment. It does put some people on the hot seat because they know they're being recorded, but if they say something that turns out not to be the right thing, they learn from it. We also can stage cases across a continuum of case difficulty and baseline skill. So I'll play some of these cases in a little bit, and you'll see that some of them involve very minimal physical harm, and some involve substantial physical harm to sort of create different stress or levels of how likely this is to happen in one's practice. And importantly, these videos are standardized. So rather than having a bunch of standardized patients perhaps do this differently, it's the same thing across a group. And we've been able to deploy this with up to about 100 learners simultaneously. We also have preceding research that the feedback is actionable and relevant. So this is what it looks like on a phone. You can see there's a sort of a one paragraph case description. You play this video. After playing it, in this case, it's just an 11-second clip. It switches into recording mode, and when the user's ready, they can hit the green record. They can record up to 2 minutes. So what this does is it moves through it, rather than having lengthy conversations, it allows sort of rapid cycle practice. And for each case that we designed here, usually a case would have 3 or 4 vignettes in it, sort of simulating the beginning of a conversation, a couple of prompts about patient fears, about trust, about need for emotional validation, and then some closing pieces. So we've built cases that fragment key aspects of disclosure conversations and present them in a very time-efficient way. So definitely not the same as holding a full conversation, but for the tight time constraints of GME education, this allows you to get a lot of activity, a lot of practice in 15 to 20 minutes. Here are the questions that we share with the Mechanical Turk audience, and it's 6 items that cover really the core domains of what makes good disclosure. There are questions about accountability, honesty, being sincerely sorry, understanding how the patient was feeling, caring about the patient, and just an overall response category. Every audio clip is rated on all 6 of these domains on a 1 through 5 scale, and those scores are used in average across 8 or 10 individuals to provide a score for each resident at each vignette level. In addition, after looking at a batch from several physician the MTurk users are asked, if you were the patient in the scenario, what would you want the physician to say? And that is used to provide guidance about the best response. Here's what it looks like when you get feedback in the web browser. I want you to think back a little bit to what I described as the components of expert performance theory. So here you can replay the vignette, you can reread the vignette, you see your score relative to your peers, and also you can play your response in a highly rated response of one of your peers. And this gets to that the conceptualization of what good performance looks like. And so being able to go back and say, oh, now I see how they did that. I want to incorporate that turn of phrase, or I want to think differently about how to do this in the future. I didn't expand it in the screenshot, but down at the bottom, the learning points that are gathered from the raters are presented there. So let me play you one of these vignettes, and this is an intro vignette that we use sort of as an icebreaker to get users started, because the outcome here is not particularly threatening, and this is also highly relatable to a lot of people who I think have practiced in the hospital at some point. So John Wilson is an 86-year-old man with mild cognitive impairment. He's currently hospitalized for abdominal pain and fever. He was scheduled for a fasting abdominal ultrasound this morning, and his son, Rick Wilson, who's the actor here, brought and fed him breakfast, which resulted in the ultrasound being canceled. When Rick Wilson learned the test was canceled, he demanded to speak to you. You enter the room, introduce yourself, and Rick says,
The nurse says, the nurse says they had to cancel the procedure because I fed him. Well, nobody told me not to feed him.
okay, so this test will get rescheduled. There's no physical harm. This has obviously been upsetting and very disruptive to the care. And I think for those of you who practice in the hospital, we make this mistake all the time, where we leave patients NPO for too long, or they accidentally get fed, usually not by family, it's by us. It's one of our dietary services. We forget to cancel the food order or something. So this is relatable. And I want to show you some of the kinds of responses that we receive. Focusing first on one that was highly rated by Mechanical Turk raters, and then or a couple that are highly rated and a couple that are poorly rated, and it starts to give you sort of a sense of how the content aligns with the scores. So one user responds, I can understand your frustration with the situation. I'm sorry that you weren't informed earlier that your father wasn't able to eat prior to the exam. We just want to make sure the exam we do is useful and accurate. Or, this must be so frustrating, Mr. Wilson. Unfortunately, the test was canceled. I apologize that you were not aware that he needed to be fasting for this. So you see apologies here. You see, particularly in that second one, accountability for what Rick, the son, should have known to prevent this, and not putting it on him. Here are some low performing responses. So, yeah, Rick, I mean, that is what happened, but these things happen all the time and it's totally okay. You don't have to get stressed out about it. We can schedule the procedure for another time. Right, so it's dismissive, and there's no apology, no accountability. I'm sorry if you misunderstood the instructions, but we can schedule the biopsy as soon as he has been fasting, right? Not absolutely no accountability here. In fact, assigning the blame to the patient. These are real responses. I didn't have permission from these individuals to play their actual audio, so these are transcripts. But I think what you can immediately see is that if you were a residency director and you knew these were the instincts, these are the responses of the residents in your program, you would want a chance to help coach, in particular the two at the bottom. And these are at the two ends of the spectrum, and obviously the whole set of folks in between. So you may be wondering, okay, well, that has some face validity. That sounds like it might might work, but do we really know if this works? And that's what I want to dig into, because we've spent some time researching this to answer these questions. And we began with a study at the University of Washington with about 60 residents who were volunteers, paid volunteers, coming from 3 fields, obstetrics, pathology, and internal medicine, trying to come up with a medical, surgical, and a diagnostic field, just to see if we could get this to work and sort of what happened. And we used this case design for this pilot study, where it's a pre-post crossover study. So we split the group into 2 halves, and half of them got 2 cases, and these have about 7 vignettes across the 2 cases, because one is a sequence of 3 and one's a sequence of 4. So they spent about 20 minutes with the VCA. They got their feedback, and at that time it was taking us about 4 weeks to collate and provide the feedback. We've gotten much faster at that. And at 5 weeks they came back and they did it again, except rather than just testing with the same cases where you're not really proving if the feedback was helpful, just they've gotten familiar with the case, we switched them to the other set of cases that they didn't see the first time around. And we looked at some core questions. This gets a little nerdy, and I apologize for that, but I think it's worth establishing how, why we think this is a valid tool. And the first key finding is that we do believe the VCA has high validity and reliability as an assessment tool. We did something called a G study, which looks at reliability as you sort of move from panel to panel. Are they able to tell a high performer just as well as the next group of MTurk users? Or basically, how reliable is this from assessment to assessment? And in fact, if you put together enough of a crowdsource rating pool and you give them enough cases, we actually get a very high G coefficient. So the tool, when used in that way, has outstanding reliability. And at least one aspect of validity is asking the residents what they thought. And we found very high levels of realism, relevance, and believability. The residents also reported that they found this emotionally challenging, even though this wasn't real, right? They got invested in responding to these actors in a way that is very encouraging. The second thing that we did with this study is we asked the question of, well, are these lay people really, do they really know what they're talking about, right? You might be skeptical and say, maybe they aren't the right people to assess. So what we did is we conducted a study where we were very grateful to the collaborative, in fact, and PACT, and invited a set of patient and family advisory council members who had experienced harm, serious harm, in their own care or the care of a loved one, who very well knew from personal experience what good error disclosure communication looks like. And they are the experts. I think this is really important about the VCA. So much of medical education is predicated on the idea that the attending physician, supervisor is somehow the expert. That's just not the case here, right? It's the patients who are the gold standard of knowledge about whether communication is effective or not. Obviously, we have communication experts who are physicians who have a lot to lend, but the question we should be asking is, how does any rater compare to somebody who's experienced this firsthand and knows what works and what doesn't? And this is kind of a complex graph, but I'll try to break it down for you because it conveys a very important point. This is a decision study where basically it uses statistics to compare the G coefficient, so basically the reliability of different combinations of raters and number of vignettes. And in red, you have the patient advocates, and in blue, you have the MTurk crowdsourced lay people. And basically, what you want is a G coefficient over 0.6, over 0.65 is ideal, higher is better. And what you can see is that it only takes a small panel of people who have experienced harm in their care, seeing a small number of cases to reach extremely high reliability. They know what a good resident does and what a resident who needs help. They can separate those two individuals. So these arcs up here, that the more they see and the more you add to the panel, the more incredibly reliable these estimates are. Now, the crowdsourced lay people, they start much lower, but what's important is that they eventually get there. And it taught us that you can get desirable and totally useful reliability. We can use crowdsourced lay people as a surrogate for the true experts. If we give them enough cases and we make our panels large enough and they get to a level where we can say, actually, they're going to give feedback that is meaningful when considered against the gold standard of people who have experienced harm. Our third key finding from this study is actually that the residents improved with the feedback. Now, it was a pre-post study, so it's sort of a weak design to assess this, but their average score was about 3.5 and it jumped to about 3.7 with that feedback. And that gave us a lot of encouragement that this is a technique that we should be exploring further. So that study has some important limitations, heterogeneous group. It wasn't part of a curriculum or included with a lecture. We paid the volunteers, small sample size. So we needed to move past this, but we had some really important evidence that we were on the right track. And the next step was to conduct a multi-site pragmatic trial integrated in a curriculum with an adequate sample size and a robust method. And that's what we did last year. And this study was intended to ask, what's the effectiveness of layperson feedback in a real-world setting as part of an error disclosure curriculum? And what would make this useful and acceptable for GME leaders to include in a curriculum? This randomized trial was conducted at 7 internal medicine and family medicine residencies in 6 states across the US, and we had a goal of recruiting 100 participants. And we used a slightly different study design where all of the users got a lecture given by me or Tom Gallagher about error disclosure. Then they had time to practice with the VCA using 2 cases, and then they were randomized to either get their feedback or not. And then we had them come back for another conference. We talked about, we gave a lecture on CRP design and implementation, targeted at a resident audience, and then we had them take 2 more VCA cases. Now, the ones randomized to control, they weren't really left out. They got all of their feedback at the end of the study, so this was fair to them. Just sort of for your interest, I'll play one more. I'll play a vignette that what was in this study. So a 45-year-old man is admitted to orthopedics 10 days ago for a left hip fracture. He was transferred to you with postoperative hyponatremia from SIADH and mental status changes. Postoperative left leg swelling was noted, and a duplex scan found a deep vein thrombosis. The patient was started on enoxaparin at the standard dose of 1 mg per kg every 12 hours with daily weights. And 4 days later, the patient has a massive upper GI bleed requiring 6 units of blood, and endoscopy finds diffuse gastritis. On reviewing the chart, you notice that the patient's admission weight is listed as 160 kilograms, which seems high for the size of the patient. No weights had been recorded since. You asked for the patient to be reweighed, and his weight is 85 kilograms, not 160. Based on his faulty admission weight, the patient had been receiving nearly twice as much enoxaparin as he needed, which has led to this GI bleed. The nurse has told him his blood was too thin, and now he's asked you to explain further. You are now meeting to disclose the error. You enter the room, and he asks,
I heard I bled because my blood was too thin? That's never been a problem before. Can you explain what happened?
okay, so imagine yourself on the spot to respond to this patient or a resident this could totally happen. they're the first call in the pager system to come talk to the patient, and all of a sudden they find themselves in a situation where they need to disclose. And I'll offer one highly rated response and two, this one, it's just longer, so it took up more space on the slide, but hi, Mr. Iglesias. I'm worried I have some serious news to share with you, and I appreciate you taking the time to listen. You developed a clot in your leg that we call a deep vein thrombosis, or DVT. Since you were diagnosed with this blood clot, we started you on this medicine, enoxaparin. And the way that the medicine is given depends on the weight of the patient. When you first came into the hospital, it looks like someone weighed you and recorded your weight as 160 kilograms. So that is the weight that has been used to determine your enoxaparin dose. Unfortunately, Mr. Iglesias, upon further review, this seems like a much larger weight than you actually weigh. When we recently reweighed you, you weighed only 85 kilograms, so it appears for a few days you were getting about double the weight-based dose that you actually needed. I'm so sorry that this mistake occurred, and I fear that by getting double the dose that you actually needed, it could have contributed to the recent bleed in your stomach. So compare that to these other two responses that received lower ratings. What happened is that you were given a higher dose of the anticoagulant, the blood thinner, based on a false weight report. So the dose of blood thinner is calculating according to weight, and you were given higher, much higher than your weight, because the weight was recorded higher. So factual, but not really answering many of the questions that the patient may have. Or unfortunately, I do suspect that the medication you've been receiving, enoxaparin, that would thin your blood while you're hospitalized, I think this might have been what caused the bleeding in the lining of your stomach, and we had to give you blood. So this one is actually evasive. It's the opposite of accountable. It's factual in attributing it to the drug, but it sort of creates the impression that it's the drug's fault, and that there's no mistake here, right? So this is somebody who could really get into trouble going down this road and ought to have some coaching. So these, again, are the kinds of responses that we were seeing across this population of residents. I want to describe the results of the study. Unfortunately, this is still in peer review, so I don't have a journal article to be able to point to, but I'm going to share these results. We had about 181 second-year residents across these 7 residencies who we could approach, and for, it's hard to get every one of them to conference. I think if any of you are medical educators, you know there's all sorts of folks who have a variety of reasons why they're not going to be there. And we were fortunate to have 154 complete the lecture and the time 1 VCA. Unfortunately, a few of those, for a variety of reasons, we couldn't use, and so we started with a group of 146 that we randomized to either get interim feedback or feedback withheld to the end of the study. And then at the subsequent conference, again, not everybody's going to be able to show up. There's vacation, there's risk, there's illness, and we had 103 total complete the study. So we met our target sample size. We also surveyed them as they participated. I want to highlight some of the survey results that I think are of interest, although some of these are not, they have been described before and are not entirely novel, but it's an important reminder. About half of them said they never participated in error disclosure, and we asked them about how often and what role they played. Most of them had been in 1 or 2 conversations about errors. Nobody had been in more than 5, which I think makes some sense for second-year residents. But of those who had participated in real-life error disclosure, about half had taken a non-speaking role, so they're really just observing. And I think this continues to point to the deficiencies of informal education. It's not really a robust vehicle for residents to practice or get feedback. Now, one of the things that we discovered that was a little bit humbling, although maybe not surprising, is that only slightly more than half of the residents in the intervention arm actually reviewed their feedback. And of those, most spent less than 10 minutes. Now, across the board, they regarded the various forms of feedback to be somewhat useful. And what was most useful was that exemplar, that ability to listen to somebody who had done this very effectively and learn from them. But the bottom line is that this confirms residents are not likely to learn this skill through real life practice, but when we give them feedback, we're going to have to think of a better way to provide it to get them to engage, because about half didn't engage with it when it was offered. The most exciting finding I think that we had, and this is modest, but it's real, is in the overall sample, this is sort of the bottom line of the study, those in the control group had a statistically significant, or their score was significantly lower by a small amount than those who had received the intervention. And remember, a lot of these, this is probably blunted by the fact that about half of them didn't look at their feedback. But even so, with this sample size, we're able to demonstrate that getting that feedback is associated with higher scores on repeat practice. This is even more true in this cohort of, so this is all residents in the trial, those who reported they had not had real life error disclosure experience had an even greater jump in their improvement. And so we think this is an important finding to really highlight how valuable simulation is, especially when you can't count on real life practice to give you the practice that you need to develop a skill. One other really interesting finding is that those who perform, remember we had about 146 do time one, and then about 103 came back. The 43 who dropped out were significantly more likely to have worse scores on time one. Now, they didn't know that, but I think what it uncovers is that the residents who, with one test, may have gotten frustrated or embarrassed or found it hard, those are the people who needed the training the most were the ones who were least likely to look at their feedback and come back. So it really speaks to how important implementation in a curricular setting is going to be to make use of this benefit. These are violin plots, and basically there's a smoothed histograms that show the scores of the cohort, the control group and the intervention group. And what I just want to point out is that in any group of residents, this should be no surprise, there are high performers, there are people getting scores well above 4, and there are performers down at the low end getting scores around 2. And so the median's here, but it's a very heterogeneous group. And as a residency director, you're likely to want to know where does my program stand, and where do I need to devote the coaching? Because not everybody walks in with the same skills. They're really spread out. So the summary of this study is that providing residents with feedback about their error disclosure communication is associated with higher ratings in subsequent practice, and that benefit is greatest for those who don't see this or haven't yet seen it in real life. And this study addressed many of the problems with our pilot study. We have robust methods with a randomized single-blinded trial, a large multi-site sample. It was embedded in a curriculum, but we still need to know more, and we need to figure out how to engage the residents who needed more. And to try to understand that, we surveyed and interviewed 25 faculty who are in quality and safety education roles in these programs, and most of these individuals were helping me on the ground because I was doing the lectures, or Tom was doing the lectures from Seattle, and they had faculty in the room to sort of coordinate the activities with the VCA. All those faculty took the VCA themselves and thought about how, if this weren't supported by a research study, how they would implement this in a subsequent year. And we used a very well validated instrument called the AIM instrument, which is the acceptability of an intervention measure. Very high scores out of a 1 through or a 0 through 5 rating for acceptability, appropriateness, and feasibility. Also confirmed from these interviews that this is relevant, realistic, easy to use. Some complaints that I think are inherent to the format, that it's not as engaging as a real conversation because it's fragmented. But what it uncovered is a lot of uncertainty about how to balance the application of this for residents around this topic of formative versus summative assessment, right? This produces a score, and when people feel graded and judged, especially if they're being recorded, it can be really threatening. On the other hand, you can understand where a residency that has to meet a new mandate around competency wants to know, how are my residents performing? And I think there was a lot of angst around how much faculty access to the scores should we have? Should we just completely separate ourselves from this, let the residents learn from it and never see how they're doing or not? And there's really, I think, a diversity of opinions, and probably this would be executed differently in different residencies depending on their culture. One compelling, I think, way around this might be to pair faculty coaches with residents who create a trusted individual who can sit down and review the results. Obviously, that's time intensive. We also discovered or sort of learned after the fact that having residents review their results, even if it's 10 minutes of their own time, it's not going to happen with reliability. And so we need to rethink how we carve out protected time to review the feedback. And our interviewees identified a handful of software changes that would help us to do this better. So we're thinking now about how do we improve the VCA to make this a great tool for sort of the next step of hopefully wider use. And we're focusing on issues of realism, and this is pretty aspirational. I don't know how soon this will happen, but you can imagine moving from static simulation to a dynamic conversation through artificial intelligence. I do think something that will hopefully happen sooner is, instead of, we've gotten our feedback window down to 2 to 3 days, but I know any user, they want to know instantly how they did. And we're going to try, hopefully, if we secure the funding, to test whether AI or other machine rating tools can give adequate rating or coaching sort of immediately. We'll explore these issues of psychological safety and whether pairing with a faculty member would balance these issues of a safe learning environment, but also accountability for both the learner and the program to do this well, and then continue to look at the quality of the feedback that's provided, because that was one of the areas that the written feedback was not regarded as the most helpful aspect of the tool. We're exploring in other ways that are not necessarily research, but trying to figure out how many people can we push through this, right? This has to be scalable. And so testing with larger and larger audiences, testing with more exemplars before the practice to sort of pre-coach, trying it with medical students, with coaching, and then trying to think about ways that AI could be involved. So here's the summary of what I've shared with you. The key regulatory event that you need to know about, if you weren't aware, is the ACGME now requires demonstrating competence in error disclosure for residents and fellows, not just demonstrating they received training. I don't think lectures are going to cut it, and a lot of our in-person simulation tools can't scale to the size of the problem. The VCA does provide practice and feedback for error disclosure communication skills, and a growing body of literature, both published and a little bit unpublished, but hopefully coming soon, supports the VCA as an efficient, valid, statistically reliable, and effective real-world tool for providing this training. And we're interested to get this into wider use. So I'll stop there. That's, I think, right at 11:50, and I'm happy to first of all, I'll say, get in touch with me if you want to get involved. And also, let's see if there are questions in the chat.
Yeah, there is a question in the chat that came through. So are there non-residents or non-physicians involved in this learning, or is it just residents? Like, has it been expanded to other healthcare team members, such as clinical risk managers, who are often involved in such communications, if not the actual disclosure coaching for the physicians?
That's a great question. We would love to do that. And it has not been used in that way except in pilot testing. So when we designed all the cases, we had panels of attending physicians take this not to see what their educational outcomes were, but basically to say, do you think this could happen? As an expert in your field, is this case realistic? Is it relevant? Or is somebody going to say, oh, that doesn't, you can't, if you present a case where somebody says, oh, that never happens, you're not going to get them to engage with the learning. So we had panels of attendings try it in that way. I would love, this is an issue of time and funding. Those are great audiences where now that we've laid the groundwork, we'd love to try in other groups. John Moorhead asked, were there differences between the three specialties? Oh, sorry, maybe sorry. Well, I'm going out of order. I'm sorry. So actually, yes and no, they were modest differences. The group that struggled the most was the pathologists, and in some of so they had lower ratings. It was a small convenience sample size, so it's a little hard to know what to make of that, but we talked with some of them, and what we heard from a lot of the residents were like, hey, we went into pathology because we don't want to talk to patients in the first place, and you're asking me to do literally one of the most uncomfortable, unpleasant patient interactions possible. I hate this. And we had actually a handful drop out because it was so stressful. And so it taught us to think more about how do you appropriately tailor the case material to the specialty. But we haven't, because that was a small convenient sample, we haven't really gone back and had an opportunity to do a larger study where we could draw more robust conclusions about differences between specialties. Dana asks, has there been consideration for training in pre-disclosure care team provider-patient interaction from the standpoint, for example, we see avoiding the patient or acting different or alluding to something, essentially being nervous around the patient until the anticipated disclosure occurs. That's a great idea. No, we don't have cases designed for that. We've tried to expand our case library because we're using this at the University of Washington for more and more residencies and fellowships. Our focus has been similar case sort of setups, moving, and as we build new cases, we're going into more and more specialties. So trying to create pediatric cases, for example, to expand beyond the adult cases. We haven't developed cases for a wide array of nuances around the entire arc of a CRP set of communications, sort of, and I think that would be exciting. We just haven't had the time to build that kind of case.
We did have some questions come into the Q&A, so I will read those if that's okay.
Sure.
So the first one was, did you do a sub-analysis looking at the degree of improvement for those who received feedback versus those who did not?
I assume that is that you're talking about in the randomized trial, and it is a variable that was incorporated in the ANCOVA, basically. So it was part of the multivariate analysis, if that makes sense. So it was already included, and basically the answer is yes. Not surprisingly, getting the feedback was associated with the greater degree of improvement. How does the magnitude of improvement associated with VCA feedback compare to the magnitude of improvement with in-person high fidelity simulation feedback? I honestly don't know, and part of that is because we don't rate, to the best of my knowledge, we don't rate in-person training experiences with panels of 8 to 10 people. And I think that's one of the big deficits of the existing literature, is that the ones that use standardized patients, sometimes they do have a combination of a faculty and a standardized patient involved, but most of those studies haven't established that that's a reliable way to assess skills. It's just sort of an assumption that's not validated prior to the initiation of the study. And so I don't know the answer to this question, but I would say we don't provide that level of rigor in-person simulation to have a large panel of anonymous external users doing the rating. So it would be an interesting thing to compare, but we haven't attempted that.
And then we did have another question come in from Liz, and Liz is asking, how is this funded? Through medical schools or hosting organizations?
Well, currently, all this work was funded by the NBME, and so they provided grant funding for my time, but then they also funded the actual cost of obviously they created the software, and then they funded the incremental costs of its use. For the way that we are using it, it costs about $10 to rate one resident, and it can be less than that. It can be $6 to $8, but basically what happens is for each of these ratings, an individual is paid 10-20 cents, and they sort of that all adds up to a cost per resident in that range. So what we suspect about that is that ends up being cheaper than standardized patients, but it's going to be a barrier to widespread scaling. But currently, this isn't a commercial product that you can buy, so it's sort of within research settings that we're trying this, and I think that'll change. My hope is that with machine-based rating, we'll basically get it down to, I don't want to call it free, but like negligible cost to provide ratings. And so in the long run, I think there'll have to be some medical school costs borne or residency costs to host the software and to organize it. And we think those will be modest, but they aren't fully defined as this moves out of the research setting. Can you share the new requirements for training and disclosure for residents? I can. I don't have it like handy where I can drop it in the chat. Basically, if you Google ACGME Common Program Requirements Error Disclosure, it'll point you to the latest PDF. It's their 2023 guidelines, but I can try to get that to Nicole to send out to the group as well.
Yeah, I'd be happy to send that out to anyone who's interested. I'll get it from Andrew, and I'll send it out later this week. I think that also brings us just about to the top of the hour. If there's no more questions, we would like to thank you, Dr. White, for sharing with us today, and thank you all for attending. This will be available on our YouTube channel in about a week or so, so please do share it with your colleagues, and we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. So have a wonderful day, everyone. Thank you so much. Bye.